Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm Michael Elliott. I'm the president of Amherst College. I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's pre-concert conversation with Jason Moran. I know that the brilliant, widely acclaimed, supremely innovative composer Jason Moran, dubbed the future of jazz, needs no introduction to this crowd. So I'm going to keep this one quick and we can get to tonight's conversation. Jason has been in residence at Amherst this week as part of the Presidential Scholar Series, a series that brings some of the most distinguished voices in the area of anti-racist scholarship and artistic production to Amherst for short-term residencies. We're absolutely delighted that Jason is this year's inaugural guest and my presidency's inaugural guest. And I hope that many of you had the chance to meet him this week and to learn from him, whether in a class that he visited, at a jazz piano masterclass, or one-on-one in a small group gathering. We are in for a true treat this evening as we experience Jason's multimedia tribute to an iconic figure in the evolution of African-American music, the ragtime pioneer and World War I hero, James Reese Europe. I'm grateful to Jason for generously offering this pre-concert conversation, and I remind you that your questions are an important part of the conversation. We have a microphone down here, and we'll be taking questions at the end of a conversation. Jason's conversation partners tonight will be Professors Carrie Polk of our Black Studies and Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies departments, and Jason Robinson, who teaches in the departments of Music, Black Studies, and Film and Media Studies. Yes, let's give them all a round of applause. Jason Moran, Carrie Polk, and Jason Robinson. Take it away.
I'll go ahead and start. It's really a pleasure to be here and to welcome such a distinguished and creative and visionary musical thinker. And I think your program this evening will demonstrate ways in which you're thinking about sort of the past of this musical tradition, the present, and perhaps the future as well. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you arrived at James Reese Europe. As somebody who is a musician myself and a historian of jazz, Europe occupies a really interesting, special place in kind of the early history of what we call jazz. If we think of the broad history of African-American music and American popular music, Europe might be more in the middle and not at the beginning. But I'm curious about how you arrived at Europe's music and perhaps how you think it might relate to your own musical development.
I'm from Houston, Texas, and I live in a neighborhood, or grew up in a neighborhood where all my mom's aunts, or sisters, actually all my mom's sisters, they all lived in the same zip code, and my grandmother did too. So you could never run away from family. You couldn't act a fool on the street, because especially not in the hood. And I say that to say that anytime I'm approaching anything is not without an acknowledgement of past and future generations. It's just impossible to not ever walk around and not see some sort of reflection of who I am or who I want to be, or who I will become. And music served that way. And I felt like some of the first things I ever tried to do was not necessarily please my own ear, it was like please my grandmother's ear. Like, did she like that? Or I remember the day my grandfather said, he heard me play something that I thought was a blues. He said, that ain't no blues. And that's tough to hear. No New York Times critic's gonna say that. All that to say, so I have great respect for musicians too. When I moved to New York City, the first thing I wanted to do, my mentor and teacher when I arrived in New York was Jackie Bayard, an important man from Worcester, Massachusetts, an iconic pianist and composer, and he taught me how to respect the history in the same way my grandmother and grandfather did. So it didn't seem a strange thing to look at history at this instrument. So what's black folks' relationship to this piano? You know, what did Scott Joplin innovate in it? One thing that came up in one of the classes was you also have to understand that not only reading could be punishable for death for black folks. But what do you think reading music looks like? You think that's also not punishable? Also, so musicians also deciding to figure out ways and tactics and strategies to elude that kind of pressure. You know, there's still that myth in music community today that black folk don't read music. It's still there. So all that stuff always is resonating and I'm thinking about when I'm approaching the piano. And so I met the great musician Randy Weston, and I hope you all know who Randy Weston is. And if you don't, he's an important figure in, as a pianist and composer, thinking about the way the world, and especially Pan-Africa, sounds at the piano. And he sat me down in his Brooklyn home and said, "Jason, I want to tell you about James Reese Europe." And he gave the best 6-hour lecture. And Randy Weston is about this tall, you know? So he's about that tall, so you have nothing but respect for my brother. And when he sits at the piano, his knees are this high and his hands are, you know, like, I always have loved Randy, rest his beautiful soul, but he was the one, I had heard the name every once in a while, sporadically, but he's the one who brought it to the fore. And a few years ago, for the centennial of the end of World War I, there was lots of talk about how people can re-look at that history, and this became one of the projects that was supported to be created, and thankfully to really bring James Reese Europe back to the fore as something that is integral to the way black music emerged.
That's so wonderful. I was lucky to meet Randy Weston when I was a graduate student at NYU. And one of the things that he said in his conversations is that when he was a younger cat, that the older cat sat him down and said that the one thing that we should have done better is to create institutions. And so I think about that in terms of Jim Europe's time with the Cleft Club. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because that seems to be an important part of his history before he actually joined the military and created the Harlem Hellfighters.
Well, the Cleft Club is something that comes out of need, you know. I often think that there's something that happens when you become a musician and you want to make good sound. And then you realize you can earn a living from it. And then you're like, well, how well of a living can I earn from it? Or am I being mistreated to make this music? Or am I making music that mistreats people? All those things come up at once. And then when I step off the stage, how am I treated when I'm not in the light and I don't have on the costume for the vaudeville show that I wrote the music to? Where am I now in society? And he forms the Cleft Club as a way like, I'm gonna take care of you and your people, right? So, you know, we're gonna get that together. And so he makes this union for musicians. And they buy a building in Midtown too. I don't know the address of this building. First of all, I'm just thinking that's wherever it is, thank God. But he makes this organization that's, because they're getting, you know, they're the hot musicians in New York City. Everybody wants them at their show. Ain't no DJ, you know? Like, you have to have this band or someone associated with this crew of musicians at your party if you want it to be the hot party. And so the Cleft Club becomes this grand organization. And there's this beautiful panoramic photo of them, you know, it's like 70 musicians here. And there's a second stage back where the screen is with another 30 musicians back there, you know. And Jim Europe is standing in the front. And he's facing forward, and nobody's smiling. They're just staring beautifully forward. But on this like casket, I call it a casket, that is the conductor's podium in the center of this photograph. And draped across the casket is the American flag. It's where he stands on the flag to conduct this orchestra. It has not been discussed enough, but I see it big as day every time, you know, about these images capture so many metaphors, you know, about the problems and the complexity that these musicians are dealing with. And they have families too. So you also can't just imagine, just because you see the guy on the stage, that you must not think about his mother, his sister, his aunt, his grandmother, that are all part of that family. So he's trying to ensure that these musicians are not only well taken care of on the stage, but off of the stage. And that Cleft Club Orchestra is what goes on to pioneer jazz at Carnegie Hall in 1911. I mean, 160 musicians standing on stage together, is quite a sight, But that's the way he's organizing people. Organizing music on page is one thing, but organizing souls is a whole other discussion. And somehow he's been given the gift to know how to pull people together and want to play.
Sometimes it's a little hard to impart a kind of sense to students in classes in talking about the early 1900s and Europe's sort of presence in popular music and popular culture of the time. It's a little hard to get a true sense of how prominent he was. That partnership with Vernon and Irene Castle, the sort of dance craze of ballroom dancing of that period, and having this, the sort of the racial politics of it. On the one hand, you have a white couple, very respectable, teaching America through their book and classes and events how to dance respectably. And then you have this incredible African-American group playing all of the music in what can only be considered, I think, a really innovative way, sort of merging the high society dance band types of pieces with ragtime, Europe's role in creating the foxtrot with the Castles, then eventually incorporating elements into the music that's related to this other sort of wave of music that's coming from New Orleans and Chicago, and then Harlem is sort of this destination for the development of jazz. There's this big transitional period, and Europe's at the center of it. I mean, being connected to that prominent coalition of dance, notions of class, and popular culture in the United States, it's really kind of remarkable. And I wonder what you think if Europe would have lived past 1920, if, past the end of World War I, basically, into the Harlem Renaissance. What would be the next innovation that he would be intrinsically connected to?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say. Because much of his innovation had already been planted in so many people around him. His ace is Noble Sissle, and his other ace is U.B. Blake. And they kind of bum rush Broadway with Shuffle Along. They are there. They've been working towards that. And though James Reese Europe, he's murdered, I'll tell the story later. But it doesn't delete the wave, and Duke Ellington is on that wave too. And there's this image, actually, at the end of the piece later tonight, you'll see this image of Duke Ellington standing at the grave of James Reese Europe with flowers. Now, we've seen Ellington do lots of things. We've not seen him in mourning. There's only one other image of him in mourning is for Billy Strayhorn, his partner's death. This film of Ellington sitting at his partner's, funeral. But here is Ellington in 1932, in all of his prime at that moment too. Young cat standing at the grave of James Reese Europe. That image alone tells you how important James Reese Europe was to the development. There's something else that I can't tell you what happened for the Harlem Renaissance, because I think the Harlem Renaissance did its work. And he did it by kicking at it. So did Garvey and all the other folks from the 19-teens. There was a kind of a focus on self and canon and the importance of understanding your own canon. And that is a thing you give to other folks, to make sure that they understand it. And I think people recognize that. By the time he dies, he's 40 years old, Something happens when we all get older. We ain't as cool, but we're still cool. It's what we call OG status. I am deep in OG status right now for the young cats. And so he's kind of done his work. I have to say that because he had innovated so much up until then. I mean, wow, should we layer something else onto his spirit to have brought along when he had already done so much for the community? His funeral is a massive thing in New York City, stopping traffic to bring his body uptown, past Marcus Garvey Park, these images of his funerals, a state funeral in New York City. Like, it was not a small thing. I remember when Biggie Smalls died. I remember them bringing Biggie Smalls' casket through New York City, bringing it by uptown through the Apollo. I remember what that felt like. It was massive. But Biggie was 20, he was in his early 20s when that happened. But James Reese Europe had offered so much already that this wave that we're kind of witnessing now, I feel like, because there is now energy around people who have been kind of deleted from our footing, which is a standard practice for America, delete where your steps come from, But in black music, we can really trace the steps. But it doesn't mean we see all the footprints. And so James Reese Europe's footprints still have lots of space up here. When I watch the HBCU marching bands, that's James Reese Europe crew. No, it's not abstract. No, it just is. The way he gathered brass together is the way all marching bands work to this day. The way that they blare on those horns, brothers playing trombones, you'll hear it tonight. It's not a far reach. It's close. So his work for me still seems like, it's just people should talk about it a little bit more. But when you talk about it, you have to talk about the complexity of black musicians not just having their craft that they can care about. They're burdened with so much else, And as Archie Shepp, who will come here later tonight, he says, we do this work in spite of all of the ills you have brought to us,
I'm glad you brought up Biggie, just because we should always bring up Biggie. But specifically, I want you to help me understand what kind of person, what kind of man, at the height of his musical popularity, decides to join the military. I mean, it's one of those things where I was sort of thinking that, given his influence, it's almost like Drake deciding to join the Royal Canadian Air Forces, right? What kind of man, and what do you think drove him to make that decision?
So I always say that he learns violin when he's in Washington, D.C. from Frederick Douglass's son, Joseph Douglas. That's who his first violin teacher is. So you just let that sit in your brain for a second. First of all, Frederick Douglass played violin, and he taught violin to his son, Joseph, and Joseph taught James Reese Europe. So first, you have to understand that he's not thinking about himself, because the people who have taught him have thought about the community all the time. So, okay, all right, right? So then he figures out how to become a musician and be instrumental in the scene of New York City. But once he scales up, which is most artists, like for me, this is scaling up. I like to work with a trio, that guy and that guy. But when I scale up, it's very difficult. So I don't have that skill set. But what James Reese Europe does by getting the Cleft Club is it's not simply about the music, it's also about the people in the community. So, okay, scaled up, right? The Castles, right? So now his popularity is like getting broader and broader. He's scaling out. But the next place that he can scale up, truly scale up, is in the war. Scale up the terror, scale up the pride, scale up the amount of musicians you can gather together, scale up the music that you hear. I'm gonna take, W.C. Handy's blues songs, and I'm gonna and then we're gonna scale up the travel. We're gonna go across the ocean. To fight for a country is not here. For a country also that ain't gave us much, So there's something about like that willingness to look for the edge and to always be ready for it, and ready to sharpen the edge when it gets there, not simply just to peer at it. I always talk about it in terms of abstraction. One of the most important parts of black music is not necessarily that it's great, but it's that it's abstract. It's people trying sounds, gathering textures that have not been put together before. And this is a kind of abstraction. There's no grid out there that says this is how this is going to work out for you or your crew, And so he's willing to keep looking for the moment that he doesn't know. Now, we also know with age, we generally We get the things we like and we just stay within that little pocket. But he never did. And I know great artists, and I've watched some of them age in their lives and still take these really, I think, brave steps on the bandstand, but not literally putting their body on the line, though, And that one, I try to describe him the same way you do, like that's like your favorite star, deciding they were gonna, and you really wanted to go fight. You didn't really want to take a band with them. They just said, oh shit, well it's you. Well, we need you to have a band. And he asked for equivalent today $250,000 for their band because he knew they would say no. And he went back and told Noble Sissle, they're not gonna give me that money. And they showed up with the money the next day and he was a little like, ooh. But then he was ready for it though too. And I don't know, it's a kind of bravery that is singular and has to be kind of expressed that way. Not that anyone else isn't as singular as he, but that he really chose things that just were not normal. Now what happens like in the draft for a lot of musicians in the Second World War, every old cat I played with, they all were in that war, right? And then the subsequent wars, they were all in those wars. So then the music continued to be part of the fabric of terror, a kind of awful thing. And it's a different kind of bravery that they can return, hopefully, with their mind and their music in shape. But James is on, he's on one, as we say.
I find Europe's reception in Western Europe and in France in particular during that time part of a series of really interesting international encounters with African American culture over time, like the Fisk Jubilee Singers going to Western Europe, then James Reese Europe going to Western Europe, then after the war, people like Coleman Hawkins and others touring in the 30s, the late 20s and into the 30s. Right. And I almost imagine it as sort of potentially sidestepping some of the kinds of racism and politics in the American context and creating a dialogue directly with people in Western Europe. Your comment earlier about the photograph was making me think a bit about the kinds of artifacts that remain of Europe's music and career. In my office, I have a photocopy of the incorporation papers for the Cleft Club, and I cherish that little thing that I got at the Schomburg. But we don't really have all that many recordings of people that were active in that transitional period from sort of ragtime in the 1880s and 90s into early jazz. I mean, if we think of the first jazz recordings being the original Dixieland Jazz Band or New Orleans Rhythm Kings or King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, 1917 to 22, 23, thereabouts. James Reese Europe is sort of this other thread, right? And there aren't that many recordings. And the way most people perceive ragtime today is through the published sheet music for piano, right? Like Stephen Foster's music was published, like W.C. Handy's music was published. In a certain sense, there's something missing from the historical record, but these recordings of Europe's group and the Hellfighters, his music with the Castles, it offers a little glimpse into this magic period. It's like those missing years of the early bebop era, right? What if that was recorded? I'm curious about what would we hear if we heard more recordings from this early period when the recordings don't exist.
Yeah, there's only a handful of that band that exists, his orchestra, before the Hellfighters band. I think maybe 12 songs that you can find online, and you can hear a few of those songs we'll play tonight. But he used to think of the strings as the most important part of his music. He loved the strings. And so the Hellfighters is all brass. And so he had a major shift in there, right? So the song we play at the end is called, Castle House Rag. And Castle House is really played with like 60, string players, all kinds of, modified guitars and violins and percussion. But there's a book of a lot of his music, piano music, all the music, especially that period for the dance bands, But we hear some, it's a song that I'm not playing tonight, but actually, I want to play you a part of it, because I want to demonstrate how incredible his voice leading is. So voice leading is the term, it's like how you move from harmonic space to another harmonic space. And you can't just simply just jump, you kind of have to have a way that you dance through it. And this piece does this moment, I'm gonna play it, I was not intending to, but I'm gonna play a part of it, because what you'll hear in this phrase, the way it falls and the way it continues to resolve, but then it's an incredible piece of music, and so it's in this collection of James Reese Europe published piano music. And the other part that's tricky about his canon is because, he's also being paid to write these songs that are basically like minstrel songs too. And I know he's feeling that rub, about this is what I'm asked to do. How do I wrestle out of this paint? You know what I mean? How do I wrestle out of this costume that they're saying that we are on the stage? He builds those years between 1905 and I think 1915 figuring out how to bust out of that, and not get sucked back into it. And the war, that invitation into the war is a true that's all behind me, But anyway, that piece has this total elegance and complexity, and also has a sense in the texture, the way harmony and friction need to live together before they resolve, It's an incredible piece. One of the things we're doing after we leave here is on Sunday and Monday, we're going into the studio to record this music. And that piece I have to play a solo version of because okay, I'm also manipulating it a little bit, but that's kind of what's there. It's really that's really close to what's on the page. But the music always demands that it be heard today. It can sit in a book closed until you open it and play it, but then how do you share it with people? So I think as a composer, he's always kind of in the middle of finding that, and also looking for a group of people who can help bring that friction to the front,
I'm glad you brought up the idea of minstrelsy, because it made me remember thinking about Jim Europe, Amiri Baraka's critique of ragtime and blues people. And I was wondering what you think about the critique, I mean, there are a couple of things I just wanted to make sure I got Baraka, his words correct. In terms of his critique of ragtime by calling it, quote, a paradox of minstrelsy, insofar as it was a music that the Negro came into imitating white imitations of Negro music. And then he goes on to say that I mentioned ragtime here because it seems to me important to consider what kind of music resulted when the Negro abandoned too much of his own musical tradition in favor of a more formalized, less spontaneous concept of music. The result was a pitiful, popular debasement that was the rage of the country for almost 20 years, end quote. Now, I think that it's Mary Baraka, Leroy Jones. It's hard for me to critique him just because it's Mary Baraka. But there's something when he begins to link Jim Europe as someone who is responsible for this. There's something I think that I believe he's missing something. That in some ways that he's writing Europe out of the tradition that he, in fact, is working so hard to substantiate within blues people itself. And I was wondering how you begin to understand ragtime in this way.
Yeah, one of the basic tenets of ragtime is syncopation. And one of the basic tenets of black music is how syncopation changes from decade to decade. It's that black music doesn't necessarily change only by lyric content or how much technology is around. It's actually in the beat itself. And how then we say the way the syncopation lives. I'd say in music today, most music that I hear coming out of the radio is the way that the hi-hat is. And the new syncopation is synced there. So ragtime was about syncopation. I always think the metaphor in syncopation is that it can't wait for the downbeat any longer. The downbeat has to emerge sooner. Actually, why don't we all push all the rhythm forward before the downbeat? Because that's where we need to be. We need to get to the Harlem Renaissance. So let's throw all this syncopation up to get us to the Harlem Renaissance. That's what, for me, syncopation is. That also comes out of the way people ragged songs for ragtime, is that you change the rhythm on it. Now, I also know that I've been doing a lot of research about Louis Armstrong, as the Louis Armstrong Museum will open next year in Queens, New York. And I'm curating an exhibition through his incredible archive that he has, right? Also a musician who, born at the beginning of the century, right? Gets to New York in the 1920s, changes the history of music, becomes the first pop star, very famous, like James Reese Europe, lives longer than James Reese Europe, also battles all the technology that places a kind of framing around a black musician or performer on a stage. He battles all that and battles the critique of Amiri Baraka. There's a photograph of Louis Armstrong sitting in his recliner with his shorts on, his beautiful legs showing, reading, blues people. He's reading it. And so there's this interview of Amiri Baraka in early 2000s on NPR where he retraces his language about Louis Armstrong. And he says, actually, I had it wrong. Actually, what he was doing was the most revolutionary act. And so there's something also that changes. We all change. We know that, right? There's also something that happens when we get older and we understand what other people have gone through just to get that content out. And I think James Reese Europe battled it, and then he battled it by saying, you know what? We have to take care of our own canon of music. We have our own language. We should have our own orchestra. Like that's what Cleft Club is about. He's placing that language at the same time, Du Bois is, the same time Garvey is, right? It's very much a thinking that is happening around him. For me, I always think of ragtime still as a bizarre thing because they somehow put it down on paper, It's Sojourner Truth, it's like people putting parts of the story, onto the paper for somebody else to hear. I think most of the students I was asking, kind of polling some of them, they know Scott Joplin's music from the ice cream truck or wherever they heard it from. Like it still lives in people's imaginations somehow. And I think Wait, are we going to be quoting a Drake song 120 years from now? Maybe. Maybe. Which one, though? You know what I mean? Now you got to choose one, because somehow that emerged. And I think there's something now, if there is something I think Barack is onto, is about how black music, as it emerges, when does the edge get softened and then pasted into commercial culture? That's what's happened to Duke Ellington. Somehow it's so badly played in hotel lobbies across the world that we've forgotten that this is a genius, you know? Or the deletion of a Mary Lou Williams into what bebop becomes. Like, then we forget, or we don't know. And those are the things that I think this new us, right? Us in here who learn these new things about what the music is and has been, that we have to kind of bring up and have a discussion about. Not simply about what could have. How do you do it in a way where you offer a little bit, a little bit of, like you put yourself, empathy, put yourself in their shoes, you know, to step on stage again and again and again in front of people who don't want to see you when you step off stage. The psychology of all that, you know, to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, I think is, tremendous.
Today, for many people, I think these terms, ragtime, jazz, blues, they're such stable signifiers. And when I think of Europe's music in 1915 or in 1911, it's such a transitional period. And, you know, in Harlem during that period, the way that music was being marketed, performed by African-American groups in these kind of comedy musicals, gradually over time, this term to ragtime as a verb, was slowly replaced with the term to jazz or jazz itself. And now these words are so stable, right? It makes me think of another chapter in Baraka's Blues People book, swing from verb to noun. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, right? So Ellington helps codify it, kind of as a joke, actually. So when I listen to Europe's, the Hellfighters recording of Memphis Blues by W.C. Handy, one starts to think, okay, is this blues? Is this ragtime? Is it marching band music? Is it jazz? And now, historically, we sort of position it as something that is this larger ensemble music that is a premonition of jazz, like there's something in it that's jazz. How do you hear that? I mean, do you hear it beyond the stable signifiers of today? And I'm curious about your performance tonight. The solo piece you just played, there's no container big enough for it, or it flows over all of these, the boundaries of all of these stable signifiers. So what is jazz in his music?
In art, they, like art handlers, I remember visiting the storage facility for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and they just started to talk about one piece and that it had fugitive material. Like, we're not sure how it's going to age. It might, and that's Europe's music is fugitive material. It doesn't quite sit so quietly. And I played some for a few students in the class just to actually watch 20-year-olds listen to 1918. I just did it really for that, not for the listening, just to like watch. I don't know. I don't listen like that, And when I was, and like I said, like when I talk about my family, like I don't see. I know my grandmother mostly because she needs me to take her to the store, and so I don't see like that bracket. When I got to school, I was listening to music from the 1930s, but I was 18 years old. Like it didn't seem odd to me. as a person who was trying to care about this. And if I knew I was going to study with a musician who had been in World War II, I probably should know what it sounded like when he was 20 years old, so that I can have some sense of what it felt like to play that kind of music in my hand. Not necessarily what I thought was cool. But that felt normal to me to kind of listen with that widely. And I think when we listen to music, or what I would charge people to do is listen to music from other centuries. Now, okay, at some point you're going to reach a gap, and you're going to miss a lot, and that's when you have to figure out what the next step is and how do you find music. But for a musician, I don't listen to it that way. And now, really, even watching the contentious term jazz now have it could be a partial deathbed. People are really trying to get rid of the term. I mean, many of our favorite musicians didn't think that was the way that music should be described. It was placed on it as a framing device. And that framing thing was a thing that I think we've been always trying to get away from. Ellington has this comment like, there's no, it's not jazz, it's like, is it good or is it bad? That's music, And I think when we're trying to make culture, you're not necessarily thinking about the box you need to put it in. And I think Europe is figuring that out too. Like, what's the music that he played in Carnegie Hall in 1911, Like, did that sound good to him in 1916? Versus, did that sound good on a battlefield? Like, all the rules change around that framing that he's, like, looking for. And that, for me, that's where the evolution also lives. It's like, where are now we placing the music? So by the time the 1920s happens in Harlem, we have the Savoy Ballroom. We have all these clubs beginning to open, these bands starting to gather, people starting to dance, White club owners saying that no black folk can come in here, but white people can come dance to the band, Odd stuff like that, that continues decade after. And that place part, so it's not simply the music itself, but it's then where does it go? For whom gets to listen to it? Who's paying for this, Like those other questions around the economy of the music, all the kind of underworld money wrapped up in the beginning of the music too. It's a huge underworld that is also funneling money into the community, into the music, into the drugs in the community. Like, it's all living together. It is not separate from one another. And I think in that placement, then you get a sound that comes like, this is the sound of society, It's in the beginning of, I always tell my musician students that they should read the beginnings of all Toni Morrison novels so they know how to do an intro. She just cuts through the chase. In the beginning of one of the book, I guess, hopefully it's coming out. We met her once and played a show for her in honor of her receiving an award. And when she came on stage to accept this award, she said, I'd like to read the first couple of paragraphs from my latest novel. And I'll never forget this, what the first sentence was. First sentence of this new novel, hopefully it'll come out, is, I put the cup on the windowsill to catch the blood. And it's that kind of precision that I think Jim Europe has, right? It's that kind of precision that goes beyond like genre at that moment. It like knows how to like slice in it. Me playing that phrase right there, it just, somehow they know how to do that. And that, that's in choreography, that's in public speaking, that's in cooking, that's in, it's in all of that. So, yeah, got way off topic, but. Sorry.
You need the cup. You got to catch the blood. I believe we have time for a few questions. We have the mic right here.
What happened to the strings? What happened to the strings?
The war happened. Yeah, the war, he's not going to bring all those strings to the battlefield. He's like, so there's an unpublished, it's a beautiful book at the Library of Congress website that his partner, Noble Sissel, wrote. It's incredible. It's Noble Sissel, who for years decided he did not really want to write about his favorite person in the world. Noble Sissel's in many of these films that show up near the end. You'll see him with these glasses, beautiful glasses on. But Noble Sissel just recounts all of his life with James Reese Europe. And he talks about this moment like, oh, he liked the strings, but for the war, he had to use the brass. And he had to then figure out a new technique of also how to teach people that music too. So much so that one of the first, like moments where he's also thinking like Pan-Africa, so he goes to Puerto Rico to get the reed players. He had been listening to the way musicians who weren't necessarily from America, but how did they articulate? The articulation across the world changes just by geography. So he wants the horns, he wants the horns. And you'll see them, it's some of the most riveting footage of, I don't want to get welled up now, but of when they return. When they return home, there's footage of them on the boat approaching New York City, and James Reese Europe is conducting them. It's incredible footage, incredible. And we see like folks who have seen something they may never want to see again, but that they're getting back home to their people is like, and then we see the welcome and them walk up Fifth Avenue. But he needed the horns. The strings weren't gonna make it in that cold. How you doing?
I think the point that you made about black music being softened by like commercial culture was very interesting. And I'm curious if you think that it's almost inevitable or if there's a way to preserve like the message in music despite having a commercial culture.
Art doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs an audience. It always does. And sometimes people they try to pinpoint the audience they want to nail. That's where the commerce comes in. I think the documentation of it is the most important part because it doesn't say that everyone who will hear it today will solve it, So here we're talking about a musician who died in 1919. He made like one full record, one. It's like 20 songs on that record, He has less than 50 songs in public, that we can hear. But they're good. Or they're weird, Or they're bad, I don't know, whatever you think when you listen to them. So I think sometimes we get into this notion that we need quantity, like we need more, but we don't know anything to do with what we have already. And there's a certain kind of study that I try to promote in the musicians that I get to work with, is that you keep kind of like, we call it digging in the crates. You keep looking for songs, and not necessarily only the songs that are documented, but like, I was asking a class, what are the songs you heard at a funeral recently? Like what are those songs that we need for mourning? That is also important to like our placemaking in society, How do we send our spirits out of this realm to another? How do we welcome a new spirit into the world too, Those parts are equally important to the canon, if not more than the part that is commercial. Right now, we're at a very tenuous moment where streaming has tried to supplant the library, and the mythology that it lives online. It's very tricky. It's the best lie out here right now, and most of us in the room believe it. But I would be very nervous about that as a future concept of taking artists' craft and saying it lives in a stream. But the stream is polluted, like all the streams up here, like all the streams in Jackson, Mississippi, like all the streams in Baltimore, in Flint, in New York City, It's something that's happening right now. So that's where music is living. Music is living in that stream right now. So I don't know, there's always, I felt, have been beacons in the chronology of music that say a Stevie Wonder, or Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, people who live beyond the frame that was tried to be placed around them, and they always wriggled free, Prince, and those people need deeper investigation about their practices, That's why we're talking about James Reese Europe, is that practice is not necessarily consistent. There's flaws in some of those moves, but we accept them. So how do we discuss the musicians today? What are the flaws that we can accept? And us as listeners, what are the ones that we feel? Because it also, most importantly, impacts us in our bodies when we hear music, I mean, it's a lot in that answer, but the health of the music, I believe in. I don't necessarily believe, I don't know about the air that the music is breathing right now. That's the one that worries me the most for the future of the music,
Good evening, Jason. Big fan of all your work. I'd love to hear more about how you picked some of the topics that you've picked. I really enjoyed all of the All Rise work and Fats Waller, and I've really enjoyed learning so much, maybe along with you and your audiences, about James Reese Europe. Those are two fantastic people to choose to focus on, and whose music to lift up. How did you pick those two?
Yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood where my grandmama lived in the same zip code because a contemporary musician will always think they're cool by not looking at nothing old. And I think this is the biggest lie, because my coolest musician was Thelonious Monk. And Thelonious Monk never did that. He knew how to play all the old school stuff and his brand as well. So he always was keeping that canon in his hand. He never saw something strange about the technique of having to play stride piano in this way, That's an evolution from the ragtime thing. So he never saw that was something that he should take out of the way bebop should sound. He kept it central. And he had the respect of those musicians also who lived in Harlem, from Mary Lou Williams to Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, James P. Johnson. That's how I learned all those people's names, is because of Thelonious Monk. And so he somehow could pivot that way, and then he could pivot to his younger brother, John Coltrane, as well, And then he goes, and he continues to be a big influence on everybody. But it's from a musician like that who saw that he didn't see that line, marking territory about what his generation should cover. And I was taught by a musician, Jackie Byard, who thought that way, and another musician, Andrew Hill, who thought that way, and another musician, Muhal Richard Abrams, who thought that way. And like another musician, hopefully who'll be in his room tonight, Archie Shepp, who thinks that way, Charles Lloyd. Like most of the musicians, that's just my crew. They don't leave the music behind, because that becomes a fault of theirs if they do that, because they know that somebody like a Randy Weston said, yo, let me tell you about something. Dr. Billy Taylor, he rest his beautiful soul for what he meant to this community, but he sat me down like around the corner, and he was the one who talked to me about like dance music and Fats Waller also. He's also important in that conversation for me as an older musician to say, I know you think you're cool, but let me tell you something, right? And just put it in your ear for a second. Now, it might take 10 years to make the work, but also I need that 10 years just to try to get that stuff in my hands too. But Jackie Byard, my great teacher, he really solidified that historic relationship, that the left hand is the geography and the right hand is the subject. And for black music, you must figure out how to put all that on the 88 keys.
Jason, we're at time. We're going to try to fit one more in as quick as we can here.
Thank you very much for this beautiful conversation. You talked a lot about image, and this entire conversation was a lot about images and photography. So I'm wondering, and I know you have a special relation to visual arts, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your relation to the image, to the visuals, because, yeah, your language is also very visual.
Sure. I will say right now, because I have a moment to acknowledge that question, that the images you'll see tonight are by some supreme image makers. The cinematographer, Bradford Young. The great artist, John Akumfra, was kind of my director for this piece. And the great editor, Stephanie Santon, she edited the footage together. So these are three impeccable minds around image that have crafted the film you'll see tonight as well. I grew up in a house where my parents collected art and always took us out. I have an uncle who's a great artist who always kept history in mind too. And so when I moved to New York, I kept going to galleries in the daytime to try to see things. And there were gaps in my understanding about art that was happening at the same time as the music, you know? Well, I can't just listen to Monk and not know who's painting and who has those. It doesn't live in a bubble by itself. So who is Norman Lewis in this conversation? Or who is Alma Thomas in this conversation with these great musicians, you know? Who are the sculptors, you know, dealing with metal or with wood, you know? What does Elizabeth Catlett mean to the music? She means a lot to the music. She knows the musicians. And over time, getting rid of this notion that musicians had all the answers, it too. We don't, and oftentimes I needed to see something visual to represent a kind of metaphor I was trying to lay into the piano. And the artist who really transformed that was Adrian Piper, a great artist, and Joan Jonas. Both of those women show up in my life when my mother dies too. So there's just a moment where I lost bearings, and also they didn't know this, but they stepped in as a way to start to have me try to understand what is intention in music. And that was not a thing that was brought up frequently at a music conservatory. But they, as artists, started to pepper me with those conversations and language to try to deal with what does the image mean? What does it mean to step onto a stage? What does it mean to turn the lights on, you know? To really think about this as something much more deeper than just the song itself. That is a moment in time that all needs a little bit of frame. And how can I mess with the frame? You know, thank you.